The lacrosse offices will be named after Kevin Huff. Kevin is one of four boys in the Huff family: Kevin, Keith, Scott, and Stephen. I saw Kevin and Keith play. I might have played with them in a couple of games in the summer league. I got to know them a little bit. I never saw Scott and Stephen. They're all outstanding athletes. You always knew what to expect from Kevin Huff. You never knew what Keith was going to do next. You could ask Joe Ferrara and Vinny Sombrano to come up here after I'm done, which I know will be any minute. And they can tell stories about Keith Huff, and they'll start telling the stories. After the game, the party tonight, at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock, they'll still be telling the stories about Keith Huff. But I'm here to talk about Kevin Huff today. I recently had the good fortune of meeting Mrs. Huff. Well, I know where the Huffs got their toughness from. There's Mrs. Huff. She bragged about her son, rightfully so. A lot of people brag about Kevin Huff. She's a bit of a sports trivia buff too. I said to her, she said to me, you know, when my son's rushing record was broken, it really wasn't broken. So she got my attention with that. She said the player that broke it played in more games than my son. My son really still holds the record. I said, wow, that's great. I said, my mother now knows about assists and goals because of my nephew, Robert Pinnell and James Pinnell, but I don't know if I came home and said I had 1 and 7 in high school. I mean, my mother would say, that's great, while she was serving me the chicken. But Mrs. Huff knew that her son averaged the most yards per game as a running back in the history of Hofstra football. I thought this was remarkable. So I happened to have a football media guide in my home. Where's Sombrano? He knows that that's the truth. And I went home and I actually did the math. I took out my calculator and I saw the second guy to have 1,000 yards. Huff was the first. I did the division. I said, oh, wow, Mrs. Huff was right. Kevin has more yards. And then I saw 3 other guys did it. So I said, oh, okay. So I went to the next guy, and he had like 1150. Well, significantly more than Huff. And I did the math, the division, and in fact, Kevin Huff had a higher yards per game average. And this is the truth. I did the other 2 guys, and the last guy, Dimmy, I think his name was, had 1,300 yards and change. I said, oh, this guy has to have the record. No, Kevin beat him by about 3 yards. So I called Dave Cohen, and there's going to be a new category. They don't have the most yards per game in a season. We're going to have Mrs. Huff's top 10 yards per game in a season. I also, while she was bragging about these, everybody knows the Huffs of Long Island and Suffolk County. My family lives in Smithtown, so I have to hear about these guys all the time. I told Mrs. Huff that I had seen the Johns Hopkins game that Kevin took the team on his back, on his shoulders, to the 7th place ranking back in 78. There's so many dates, I'm losing track here, but I brag about my nephews. And as great as the Huffs are, and they're great, my 8th grade nephew, James Pinnell, scored 45 points as an 8th grader on the varsity. And my nephew Robert really is, he's about leading the nation in scoring as a freshman. Mrs. Huff wasn't, she was barely impressed. She was talking about the Huff boys. But I compared my nephew Robert to Michael O'Neill to give you an idea of how tough Mrs. Huff is and why these guys are so tough, I believe. I said that my nephew plays like Michael O'Neill. Johns Hopkins, a famous attacker, one of my favorites. And I said, he was number 7, Mrs. Huff. Do you remember they played in that Hopkins game in the NCAA playoffs? And he played well in the game, and they beat Hofstra. And she said, if I knew he was that good, we would have knocked him out before the game. At that point, I took a step back, and I said, okay. I said, it's no accident these guys are tough. When they told me they were going to name the lacrosse offices after me for my donations, I said, I think we should pick a player that accomplished more at Hofstra. I really did. I think, and I asked Kevin if he would share the honor with me. I mean, after all, when I walked away from lacrosse, which should have been the prime of my athletic career, Kevin was the coach and Harry Royal. But I've become friends with Kevin. He helped my nephew Robert when he was a kid. He coached him as a kid. He coached him in 10th grade, and my nephew was very fond of Coach Huff. His coaches here, Sean Keenan, they did a great job. But at first, Kevin, like Mike D'Amato, I mean, those guys are twins, but with respect to their modesty and their humbleness and their respectfulness. Kevin declined. I said, well, Kevin, it would mean a lot more to me. It would mean a lot more to Hofstra. It would mean a lot more to a number of people if you would do this. And Kevin acquiesced, much to my delight. I was thrilled when I got off the phone with Kevin. Kevin, your mother is a huge fan, but you have other fans. You have many other fans. Obviously, I'm one of them. Just to briefly touch on some of Kevin's accomplishments, he had 8 letters at Hofstra, 4 in football, 4 in lacrosse. He was All-ECAC First Team and Player of the Year in '77, honorable mention All-American. First player to rush for, he was All-American in football and lacrosse. First player to rush for 1,000 yards at Hofstra. Record at the time, my notes say.